Alright everyone, we start off talking today about the Democrats' big lie. Not the big lie about the Republicans having a big lie, which is related to election fortification or whatever. Not about the non-existent insurrection, but the big lie that there's a systemic voter suppression going on. See, you have these two boogeymen in every election. The left screams about voter suppression, the right screams about voter fraud. Now really, if you have larger election fortification honk-honk going on, that's a separate issue from both. But this is the Democrats' perennial big lie. And they talk about this constantly. It doesn't matter what the voter laws are. Down below, though, if you're watching this video on YouTube, there will be a pinned comment with links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use, as well as a link to my Substack account. I make occasional journalistic content, so you should join me on those sites as well. Keep in mind I make 4 videos a day, but only 2 of them actually end up on YouTube. You know, when YouTube is continuously abusing all of its own users, other than the priority creators, it's slowly doing what Razorfist suggested would happen years ago, which has become another Netflix. Anyway, the big lie is that laws like the one that was drafted in Texas or Florida, Alabama, or was it Georgia actually, I think was the first one, that these will disenfranchise voters. But the thing is, think about who has the ability to get ID, showing both that they're a lawful citizen and a resident of that state. Because, I mean, you can't vote in your state, cross state lines, go vote elsewhere and stuff. Citizens do. Everyone does. It doesn't matter what color their skin is, which party they've registered with, if any, blah, blah, blah. None of these things are meaningful. When you show up to get your ID, they're not going to say, well, you're black, so you have to wait longer. It doesn't happen. About the only scenario, actually, that requiring that, especially with proof of residency, could be problematic is if you move right before the election. But if you're, reasonably intelligent and it's not just spur of the moment, you're probably capable of making sure that when you get to your new state that you register duly very quickly, get your ID, and then, you can vote. A handful of people might find that difficult, but if they know they're going to move in the first place, they should get some help with that process. Who won't be able to vote? Dead people. Because you can show up with their ID, but that's going to be a problem because you're not the person on the ID, so you're going to have a problem. Illegals can't vote. Non-citizens, non-residents of those states. Essentially, all of the problems with election fortification disappear with such a voting law. But it doesn't disenfranchise a single eligible citizen. That's not the point of the law. About the only part, and I think this is the case of both the Georgia and Texas laws, if I remember correctly. The only part that seemed to rankle people was the one that, like, you can't hand out water to people in line and stuff. See, the problem with that, and it's limited to just near the polling place, by the way. If you're 500 feet back from it, you can do whatever you want. The reason is that if someone with a Clinton 2020 shirt or something comes to you in line, or Biden 2020 rather, and hands you water, technically that's attempting to bribe you. In some states, if you're attempting to give someone, I think it's the equivalent of the value of $1 or more, then it counts as a felony charge of voter intimidation or some shit like that, actually. I think I read about that the other day. A bottle of water is more than $1. It shouldn't be. I mean, you can get it from your tap, but it is. It would be illegal possibly under existing law, but the problem is you're essentially bribing someone. Because you could have political paraphernalia on, you're giving people, saying, we're going to give people food in line, they had to stand around for an hour. Well, the average person, if they're standing in line, will probably be fine for an hour or two. Voting takes place in November. It doesn't take place during the hottest part of the year. If it were July or something, then maybe the government would allocate that each location would have to hand out water to people, and it would just have a rule that you can't wear like a campaign shirt or something. But it's not really a problem. Heat stroke isn't really a problem in November for the most part. And they're talking about well, people waited for hours to vote. So what? It literally does not matter. It has nothing to do with their ability to vote. It just meant that they had to go through some effort to do so. And the Democrats keep lying and saying that rules and regulations like this with regards to eligibility to vote, they disenfranchise citizens. Every citizen is capable of getting an ID, though. Pretty much everyone already has one. You need to show your ID to do basically anything else. By the way, in some cases, I don't agree that should be actually the case. I would think that making sure you're actually eligible to vote, to use the rights of a living citizen of the United States, barring certain felons, depending on the state, and I'm not sure how they do a check on that, I would think that's fairly important. But I'll tell you why the Democrats don't want such laws. Because they want to be able to fortify elections. Because they're convinced that that's a good way forward for democracy or whatever bizarre idea they have this particular week. Well, it's not. And this will prevent voter fraud. Now, how systemic is voter fraud? We're not really sure, because in some cases, if you don't require ID, like in my home state of Vermont, there's no ID required to vote. About the only safeguard is the fact that in most of those communities, the people running the polls are like pillar of the community sorts, and so they sort of know who lives there. But I mean, let's say that I'm a poll worker, and I see someone I can't directly vouch for. Do I want to get in trouble with the state government and potentially get sued for intimidating a voter by questioning whether they're eligible, since there's no ID process involved? If they give me a name and I'm like, I'm not sure that this person actually lives at this address, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do jack shit. And so there's not going to be a fraud investigation. The amount of documented voter fraud tends to be small. It's a few hundred or thousand votes in most states. It's not flipping any elections, really. But you do occasionally have things close enough. It's like that old poem, what was it called? For Want of a Nail. And it's like, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of the horse, the battle was lost. For want of the battle, the war was lost. And so things can snowball. The problem is, if you have just a little bit of fraud, in a very close election, look at the 2000 election, probably for the best example, a few hundred votes potentially could swing literal presidential election. Literally, that's what happened in the year 2000. Bush wasn't elected. He was appointed by the Florida Supreme Court, despite Gore technically winning more votes. In the perfectly fair 2020 election, there were some fortifications going on. Honk, honk. We're allowed to say that. Yes, of course that should be stopped. There should be no ambiguity over who has won an election. And for lower elections, too, in some cases, you're voting on the ballot. There's also deciding who the governor will be, state senator, or some bullshit. Those can involve much smaller groups of people voting. So making sure there's no fraud in those elections is outsizedly important, too. Again, most of the laws you deal with are at the state level. I support these initiatives, and I haven't seen anything in any of them that, when you looked at the actual wording, wasn't vastly different from what was being reported on by the legacy media and fomented by the Dems. The Democrats essentially said they're going to make people thirsty and wait in line for hours and close all the polling places and intimidate and harass people, and legal citizens will be turned away, and people of color, their new racist terminology, will be turned away. None of these things, though, are actually true. If you look at the wording of the bills, none of those things apply. About the biggest impediment is shortening up the period in which you can request a mail-in ballot. They shouldn't even have mail-in ballots. The only absentee voting that should take place are currently overseas U.S. military, diplomatic officials, things like that, and people who have a real legitimate reason. But just, hey, I don't want to have to show up at the polls, give me a fucking mail-in ballot, that's not really legitimate. Do your civic duty. Go walk a couple of blocks, which is usually how far your polling place will be. There's a million of them. Take your pick. That's about all. Peace out.